Good afternoon, Brussels. Well, I can't promise that musical magic, but what I want to do is take you through a journey of healthcare through the ages, from ancient days to modern. Why? Because it's fun, it's interesting, but it might also give us some clues about how we've ended up with our current healthcare system, how it could be better. So we'll look at some of those magic, ancient techniques combined with modern day miracles. So I'm going to take you back to the Egyptian times about 3,500 years ago, where the sum of medical knowledge was held on a scroll that was 20 meters long, about the length of a tennis court. And that served up potions and magical medicines. And so all that knowledge contained. But it was interesting, at least the ancients, like modern days, on medical websites, they were scrolling for medical information. And a lot of that is not accurate. A lot on here was probably not the best advice. One of the pieces of advice, if you had frequent urination, which could be diabetes, a classical symptom, they prescribed cake. Maybe not what your endocrinologist would recommend. But they also had other techniques and treatments. If you're unlucky enough to get guinea worm disease, they would use a stick to pull a worm from your skin and wrap it round. I see some of you, it sounds pretty brutal and prehistoric. That's still the treatment of choice today. There's no antivirals, drugs for it. I guess a treatment we managed to stick with. And if we go further forward, it's not very far forward, still 1,000 years BCE, to many of you recognize Peru. I'm pointing at the wrong screen, but Machu Picchu. And the Incas, they had an interesting approach to surgery. They were interesting people, but you could say quite boring, because they liked to drill holes in people's heads. Why did they do that? Well, I guess you could argue it's holistic medicine, but there were a number of reasons, potentially letting out evil spirits, but also it seems like from historical examination, they had wounds from the battlefield, and it was used to relieve traumatic brain injuries. What I think was quite remarkable was that 80% of these patients survived. Not good for the other 20%, but comparing it to more modern day eras, the American Civil War, 1750s, when they treated soldiers on the battlefield with similar injuries, similar techniques, over half of those died. So the Incas, while many of these treatments might not have been medically necessary, were clearly doing something right. Now, I'll try and make it slightly interactive. When you think of Chinese medicine, and that can be herbal, it could be massages, it could be acupuncture, even the movement techniques of Qigong and Tai Chi. How many of you feel that or would say that you've ever had a Chinese medicine treatment? Wow, that's quite a lot of hands going up. I'd say close to half. And we're talking about something that's well over 2,000, maybe more years old. So clearly there's something there if we're still doing it. There was one thing that they used to do, though, which, and I think they still do it, was checking the color of the tongue. Some of you might be familiar, to predict what type of disease you had. Now, it turns out there's something in that, because a study last year using, yes, I'm going to mention artificial intelligence, was able to analyze the color of tongues, took over 5,000 images of tongues, and predict with 98% certainty what disease the patient had, from diabetes to heart conditions to respiratory diseases. And if we move to another era, some of you might be familiar with the ancient Greeks and their four humours. And interestingly, for me, it developed separately from Chinese medicine, but Chinese medicine, as some of you may know, is all about the qi, the energy, different parts of the body, the flow. Too much or too little, you end up with disease. The Greeks had a very similar philosophy, the four humours. So the blood associated with the heart, they were all associated with different organs. The yellow bile associated with the liver there, and got the phlegm associated with the lungs, and black bile with the kidneys. So what does that have to do with modern medicine? They do things like bloodletting, letting out the bile. It sounds prehistoric, but this was based on observation. And we can probably draw a bit of a tenuous parallel with what we do today with wearable devices, because blood here represents overactivity. So maybe it could be a kind of calming out. Similar with the yellow bile represents anger. That was a big deal in ancient Greece. If you think of Athens in rush hour, chariot rage was a real thing. You could look it up. And then depression obviously can be treated with medicine, but can also be treated with digital health applications, cognitive behavioral therapy, delivered in person or delivered via an app. So the key thing was the Greeks were really onto something with observation. It wasn't perfect, but it was certainly rooted in evidence. I might not be able to hear you, but does anyone know what the first wearable device is? I can see some of you got some wearables on. Probably impossible to hear, but I'm wondering if some of you might be thinking or saying a hearing aid, because this came out in the 1950s, would class as a wearable device. Potentially may have seen or used one of these, a Holter monitor that came out in the 60s for recording your ECG. Well, actually, the first wearable device is a lot older than that, 2,500 years old, and it really sucked. Yes, it was a leech. So again, that could sound quite brutal, but in 2004, the US FDA did approve the leech as a medical device. And obviously that's 2,500 years it took them to approve it, but that's probably quite quick for the FDA. And you may have your own experience. Well, you will have if you use wearables. But people ask me, look, you're into this stuff. Why don't you wear them? I used to wear them. I used to wear about 5 different wearables. But for me, it just became too much of an obsession with the data and not enough about the insights. I recall a few years ago, I was Super Bowl Sunday, living in New York. I wasn't excited about the game, but I was having some anxiety. I was actually wearing a Holter monitor to check for palpitations, but I also put a chest strap on to check my heart rate, just to make sure. A smartwatch, it was pre-Apple Watch. And I got quite nervous, and the heart rate was 90. I'm sitting on the sofa. It shouldn't be this high. And then it went up to 100, 110, 120. I dialed 911. I struggled down to the street. The ambulance came pretty quickly. I got back in. I'm dying. I got into the ambulance, and the technician, she ran an ECG, realized everything was fine, and then heard my phone start beeping saying, check in on your heart, check your blood pressure. And she just looked at me and said, this is your problem. And I think she was right. Fast heart rate caused by wearable devices. I guess it could be called tachycardia. Not sure if that will catch on. But certainly, I don't use wearable devices. What I do use is ChatGPT and other AI tools for therapy. I do have a real life therapist. I kind of feel I'm cheating on him a bit with ChatGPT. But for me, it is really useful. I'm able to reflect. The other day, I got into a cycle where I started to feel sad. And I thought, well, there's no reason for me to be sad. It's kind of, dumb that I'm being sad. So I was judging myself and then realizing I'm allowed to be sad. I shouldn't judge myself. And then I was getting angry about judging myself and then guilty about feeling angry. So I was able to slow down, put this through ChatGPT and reflect and have really good conversations with my therapist. Now, I'm not saying this works for everyone, not necessarily recommending it, but it certainly works for me. But of course, there are downsides. You could get the wrong information. You could get pushed down a dark path. There's reports of it not stopping people who are looking for options for suicide, and it carries on and tries to be helpful when they actually need another kind of help. So anyway, enough about me. I think we're back to the important mission in the time that we've got left of solving modern medicine. And the key thing has to be all about early diagnosis and artificial intelligence. So, for example, using AI to analyze medical images, CT scans, predicting diseases that people get, like cancer, predicting those early, being able to treat them. It's also able to analyze blood samples to predict colon cancer early, Alzheimer's, which is obviously difficult, but you may be able to do something about that if you find out early. And the dog is here not just for emotional support, but actually dogs have been used to sniff out cancer for quite a long time, but a new technique is being used where the dog is given the sample to sniff to see if it's got cancer, but AI is used to measure the dog's physiological reaction so it can get more precision as to whether that sample contains cancer than, say, the dog being trained to woof or another movement. So early diagnosis, surely that's what it's all about. Well, actually, we need a bit more than that. We need to combine devices that we're wearing, scans, medical exams, blood tests, our genetic data. Take all the stuff that's collecting that data, take all the data itself, plug that through artificial intelligence models, and the problem is solved. Everything is great. No, you don't need to leave yet because it's not solved. There's still a problem. It sounds great. But we've got a problem called sickonomics. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but we've got a couple of big problems going on. One of them is the big food industry that's trying to keep us unhealthy, and they're not deliberately trying to keep us sick. They want us to live, they want us to spend more on fast food, but they want us to become addicted. And the more we have, the more money they make. But enter the superhero, Big Pharma, because they can keep us alive. They'll keep us sick, but they can give us insulin, other drugs that we need. Maybe if we're lucky, we need to lose weight, we get a new shot of the GLP-1 medicine. So these are big problems, and they're not driven by AI, they're driven purely by profit. Well, surely our doctors, the healthcare system, can help us. Well, the problem with that is the incentives are all twisted. You may have experienced this with your doctors, but if we're sick, it might sound like bad news, but it's actually great news when we're sick because the healthcare system makes more money. Doctors get paid to prescribe, to see patients, surgeons to perform operations. The healthcare system runs on your sickness, so keep getting sick. That's the message. You see, it doesn't sound a good message because we want to stay well. But if we stay well, there's no money in it. The incentives are just not there. And it's not all bad news because things are starting to change. There's a company in the US called Virta that prevents diabetes, and they only get paid when they reduce, I think it's the A1C levels related to diabetes. When they control that and prevent diabetes, they only get paid. There's other incentives that hospitals can get bonuses or fined if patients readmit within 30 days, so they've treated them and they're not staying well. In the UK, there's diabetes prevention programs where they're paid to keep people well. But unfortunately, the vast majority of incentives in the healthcare system are there to keep you sick, not to keep you well. So not to be pessimistic, because that is changing, but it's changing slowly because there's powerful forces ahead. So the real answer to better health, the solution, in the time that I've got left. Clearly, it's around wellness, it's around prevention. We're seeing that in the system slowly coming in versus treating sickness. Technology, I've talked a reasonable amount about technology, but I wouldn't say we're there. Technology is perfect, but that's probably the smallest barrier. We've got a lot of good technology, but the problem is systemic. And the US doesn't stand for the United States. It could do, but it's more about us. The answer for better healthcare, and hopefully this is more of an empowering message, is it's about us. And I don't want to sound preachy, because if you want to drink wine, if you want to smoke, then do it. I mean, we're at a festival, a conference. If you want to get wasted, do it. That's my message, but it's tied in with making conscious choices, because a big problem is that automatic cycle of unhealthy eating, unhealthy drinking, where we don't think about it, and it just continues, and we do that without consciousness. So really awakening our own consciousness is the key to better health, and that is something that we can control. So with that, that's getting us closer to the solution for better health. We still need to rely on technology. We still need the system to have the right incentives, but we can be empowered ourselves by making more conscious decisions. And they don't have to be perfect. It's not about being obsessive about our health. And really, to close, I've taken you on a journey which has hopefully made some sense, going back thousands of years to the current age, but trying to bring it together. We had this ancient scroll, we had the ancient Greeks. They were looking at prevention, looking at systems of pattern recognition, keeping us well, holistic. So some great messages, some great thinking from the past. And now if we take the best from the future with technology, artificial intelligence, looking at the patterns within our health, and combine both, I think we can have a very bright healthcare future. And with that, I think I'm done. And just wish you a fun festival and a healthy future. Thank you.